Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Higgins. I'm a philosopher of education on the faculty here. And Chris Lubinsky asked me if I would like to introduce Deron Boyles. And that makes sense because I know him from philosophy of ed. And the question is, why did I agree? And the answer to that takes us back to about 4 years ago at a conference just like this. It was an interesting discussion, and then Deron took a little bit of a cheap shot at me, and so we have a little bit of a history. So the answer is I accepted this offer to introduce him so that I could finally exact my revenge. I'm told by Jameson that I can go as long as 15 minutes in this. No, okay. All of that is sort of what I wish I could do right now, but no. Actually, I said yes because he is a wonderful colleague and thinker, and I'm going to be boring, and I'm going to say nice things about him like you usually do here, and just keep him on the hook for the revenge. I think it's actually more painful if he just thinks year by year it's coming. So as you may already know, Deron Boyles is professor of philosophy of education in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at Georgia State, and you can sum up the prestige he has already earned pretty quickly by saying that he's been past president now of both the John Dewey Society and the American Educational Studies Association. And he really is that kind of triple threat with teaching, research, and service. I'll tell you about his research in a minute, but it's humbling to those of us who try to juggle all these balls and drop them occasionally that he has won awards in all three areas. He's won the Outstanding Faculty Teaching Award at Georgia State. He's also won the Outstanding Faculty Service Award, and even cooler than that is he has been coach of the crew team for 2 decades and won an award for that service as well. So he's really contributing in all areas. On the note of service, I also want to say that he's been a reviewer for my journal that I added, Educational Theory, and does a fantastic job. It really helps me when I get from my reviewers clear insight into the heart of the matter, and he does that. He does the reviews on time. These may sound like trivial things, but they're not. My life depends on my reviewers coming through. And he's off the board now, and I'm just counting the days until I'm allowed to put him back on because he's been great there. But let me tell you about his research. He is an absolute leader and force in the area of trying to figure out how we, as Michael Sandel put it, stop the crowding out of non-market values as market values encroach on teaching and learning and schooling. And he started this line of his research, which isn't his only line, but I'll tell you mainly about this. This first book, American Education and Corporations, The Free Market Goes to School, that won the Critics' Choice Award. Then with 2 edited books, Schools or Markets, Commercialism, Privatization, and School Business Partnerships, and then The Corporate Assault on Youth, Commercialization, Exploitation, and the End of Innocence. There's a nice, happy title for you. And what I like about Deron's work, too, is that in addition to doing this incredibly timely, what could be more practical than trying to look at these market forces and how they're shaping and even, I want to go ahead and say, deforming teaching and learning. He also looks at more historically recessed topics and writes about figures where we might forget, were it not for work like his. He's right now working on a book on Joseph Hart, and he's also written on the politics of research. I could go on, but let me just leave it there, and why don't you welcome Deron Boyles.
Thank you, Chris. I do look forward to the hook someday. I expect it'll come in the form of a chokehold from wrestling of some sort. I'm not quite sure. I didn't think it was a cheap shot at the time. I thought it was a serious, legitimate academic point. I'll maintain that for the day. We'll see. So this paper is, I don't have a PowerPoint, and I'll just talk through because we've already shared these. But the paper is really intending to call out questions of the discourse that we use when we talk about schools, and particularly when we talk about public schools. And my concern is that the market logic has infiltrated our terminology to such a degree that we find it increasingly difficult, even if we're mindful of trying to do it, of distinguishing the terms that we use from a private or market-oriented narrative or from a more public narrative. So I begin the paper with a couple of gestures toward history and pointing out that there's nothing really new that we're talking about here. Others have made that point today. But that there are some significant developments in recent history that I think are informative. And I talk about the debates about push, the advanced placement history, the strident sorts of tones about what gets included in the curriculum. So in Texas, for example, you have to talk about free market economics. In their economics courses, you cannot talk about anything that is anti-capitalist. And they've even shifted the specifics of their ruling to be sure that you don't even use the word capitalist, because you could link the word pig to that, and that would be an epithet, and we can't talk about that. So instead we talk about free markets, because free markets are a happy, uplifting sort of idea. I use Carl Glickman here at the beginning of the paper because he did this sort of spoof in the Kappan in which he took the Business Roundtable's narrative from A Nation at Risk, I think, and just flipped it on its head and said, okay, so we're having this big recession going on right now. Maybe it's the case that educators should step in and help our business colleagues because they're floundering right now. So we're going to set up an education roundtable instead of the business roundtable, and we'll tell them how to get through their problem. So here's the primary claim that I want to make. And actually what I do in the paper is three things. I clarify and situate two forms of ethics as the main argument, and in so doing I don't want to reduce or bifurcate or oversimplify the point. There are lots of different versions of the kinds of ethics that I'm talking about. So there's the egoist ethics under a different sort of framework and the altruistic. I'll be using those two, but there are multiple forms, and I think in the paper I at least allude to the fact that there are not just these two, but I use these two because it seems to me that the corporate logic is ethical egoism. That is, it's an egoism that suggests that profit is the primary reason that we operate. And if profit for a corporation isn't the exact language that we use, when we talk about the college for the TFA folks who get bumps in salary, or the $60,000 that they get to go as a lobbyist on Capitol Hill, those are all vestiges or other ways of talking about profit. That is, it's still a monetary and mercantile exchange logic, and so $60,000 to a 21-year-old sounds impressive, right? And so instead of understanding that as a form of bribery, we understand that as a kind of a paid internship, and we validate it that way. Also, as much of this paper tries to point out, I'm talking about neoclassic economic theory. So neoclassical economic theory is the driving economic theory, I would argue, worldwide. It's not the only one, but it's the driving force. And I think it's the case that if we can talk about what we do in schools with an understanding of neoclassical economic theory, then we'll clarify a lot of what it is that we understand with regard to the meta-narratives and the language and the terms that we use. And we can unpack or problematize some of those. So I spend some time giving a definition of neoclassical economics. And then I conclude the paper. The bulk of it is really sort of instead of being depressed at the end of this day, as I was before I heard Chris say such wonderful things about me, I want to suggest that there are ways that we can move forward in problematizing the language, the meta-narrative, the extent to which neoclassical economic theory invades our entire existences by pointing out something called critical policy studies. And I borrow from a variety of folks to make that point, but as a way to move forward and problematize, bring students, whether they're TFA members or others, to problematize what it means to understand how policy gets enacted, who the major players are, and why policy even exists in the way that it does for the purposes that it enacts. And I think understanding that is rather key. The primary problem that I'm asserting here is that education policy is inexorably linked to business interests and promotes ethical egoism over ethical altruism. I had in the paper at one point that business ethics is an oxymoron. And I liked that phrase, but if you get into the ethics literature, you have to, as was suggested earlier, you need to nuance that a bit. And so that's why I've pulled back just a little bit from that and saying that the primary problem with applying business ethics or business logic to schools is the goals and purposes. Here's the problem. The goals and purposes of corporations are fundamentally different in kind than, and I argue, antithetical to, those of education. They are categorically distinct, and to overlay one with the other is to bastardize both. Now, I don't want at that point to say each has equal validity. I'm not going to argue a relativist point here. I think, in fact, that schools need to understand themselves as humane institutions and organizations that should not cower to neoclassical economic rationality, whether that means not having elementary schools hold what do they call them, the career days. So second graders are asked, what are you going to do when you grow up, as though you need a title for a second grader. I mean, this is the sort of narrative and pressure that gets accepted. It's typically announced, by the way, in the front of the elementary school on the placards that it's a career day, so this is a celebratory event, and it's typically also under the long list of business partners that they have for that elementary school. I make a distinction in the paper between, we've been talking about teacher preparation, and I'm not quite sure what we mean by teacher preparation. I know what we mean in terms of the programs in which we work, but I try and make a distinction, and it's an old one, so it's certainly not novel, but a distinction between teacher education and teacher training. And I fear, again, we conflate the terminology to our detriment. It seems to me that much of what goes on in what we're calling teacher preparation is in fact teacher training. And it should be instead more, not totally bereft of either, but more about teacher education rather than teacher training, because education is a much more broad, much more investigative, much more messy, quite frankly, area for inquiry, that if students are led down the path toward training, it seems to me that it leads to what Dewey called, I think it was 1929, the quest for certainty, as though the answers are already able to be listed out in the 17-step PowerPoint of here's how it is, here's what you need to do in order to be a good teacher. So, it strikes me that, particularly after today's discussions, that we are faced with a mounting number of assaults on anything that I might characterize or define as a public sphere or a public education system. When ALEC, it's the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, works in the background to alter and promote policy that is beneficial to business interests, and it gets passed off as democratic action, much like what we've been talking about today with regard to TFA and how they're trying to move individuals into leadership positions. I think we can deconstruct that in a way to understand it as a part of a democratic process, and I think that would be a fine project. I just don't happen to believe that that's the project that they're engaging in. It seems to me that it's a kind of Trojan horse, secretive, siloed approach to advance a private economistic understanding of the way the world should operate, and done so under the aegis of free market rationality. And let's just be very, very clear on this point. There are no such things as free markets. They do not exist, other than some Newtonian theoretical sort of understanding. There are no such things as free markets. What I do in the paper is to provide three illustrations of part of the problem with the privatization logic. I gesture back toward Joseph Mayer Rice, who in the 1890s went around sort of a pre-Finland envy thing where he was looking for the good schools, and once he found them, he could tell the bad schools, look, here are the good schools, and do what they're doing, regardless of context, regardless of funding, regardless of all sorts of differences. And I still think that we're chasing that kind of, again, Dewey's sort of quest for certainty. We're trying to find the answer as though there's a holy grail. There are no free markets. There is no holy grail. I don't know why people, after 100 and some odd years of chasing after this sort of quest for certainty, with this notion of certainty, why they're still thinking that they can find it. And maybe it's because those of us who have been doing this for too long get tired and just fall by the wayside, and other people who don't know the narrative of the discourse of the arguments come along and think, oh, this is novel and new, and we just perpetuate the whole Rolling Stone Sisyphean, though it may be. For those who think I'm being a little bit overboard in my characterization, in Georgia, there is actually a law in the books that guarantees our graduates from teacher education programs. So the legislature passed the law that said if a graduate of any teacher education program, the public college system in Georgia, is hired and is found to be, and this is a quote, defective, they can be returned to the college, they can be retrained, and then they can be sent out free of charge. So the retraining is a free benefit, I suppose, for the defective individual. So you have you have the graduates as washing machines coming back to the factory. You've got the professors as the sort of the line workers that are going to fix the nuts and bolts of the washing machine, and then the poor student is reduced to the washing machine itself, like this sort of broken entity. Nobody seems to understand how that language codifies a dehumanized understanding of both teaching, learning, and students. Never mind professors, because we're obviously in the ivory tower and we don't matter and all that. I also talk in here about this sort of growth model notion. Are you all familiar with this growth model approach, whereby you compare year after year how students are doing? The dirty little secret, though, is you can actually improve over the year. But in Georgia, they've got 33, 33, and 33. I sort of tongue-in-cheek say that leaves the 1% to still rule the world. But you've got 33, 33, and 33. And from third grade to fourth grade, you can improve 80-something points. But it doesn't get you far enough from the 133rd category to the next 33rd category, so you actually didn't grow. So your growth spurt has to be aligned to the percentile rankings of that third, and third in order for you to say that you're going to grow. I don't understand how growth is represented in the growth model. Finally, I point to, well, not finally, but next to finally, I point to this idea of, well, Nick Eastman, the big thing now is value-added assessments. You all are familiar, I hope, with it. It's what gets all the money. I mean, the folks from North Carolina, they got all the money for the value-added stuff to trot that sort of thing out. And the issue here is that they take a variety of snapshots, the demographic data of teachers, the students, the schools, and all its various forms, and then they say after a certain amount of time, has the teacher's actions as teacher added value to what the students have actually learned? Similar to the growth model thing, this operates on hierarchical linear modeling in such a degree that the variety of ways that you can actually identify the monikers varies over time. So again, it's the same sort of effort of achieving a notion of certainty when within the structure of the investigation there is no similar structure of certainty itself. And so it strikes me as itself internally problematic. Finally, what I do is turn to Pearson. I have a handout actually over there, Greg, if you wouldn't mind. In the paper, I give a little bit of the history. Dennis Attic and I are working on a larger piece dealing with this and how Pearson has consolidated itself over time in what I want to argue is a very Gilded Age monopolistic understanding, maybe much like TFA, which is to say, if you're Dale Carnegie or if you're Henry Ford, if you have an entire manufacturing system whereby you have raw material that you're responsible for delivering to your factories that gets molded into the product and then sold out, you get to be in charge of the entire process. It sounds similar to me like with the relay thing, TFA, and others. But Pearson has spent $5 billion, that's with a B, $5 billion acquiring 25 smaller educational publishing companies between 2007 and 2012. They're now paired with EdTPA, and that duo is coming along and requiring faculty in higher education to follow what EdTPA requires, and on my view, at least in part as a result, mitigates the concept of academic freedom altogether. You do not have the latitude to do the kinds of work that you want to do because EdTPA requirements are now being foisted upon higher ed faculty, much like teachers have been suffering for years and years. And you might say, well, okay, it's about time professors should suffer just like we've been suffering for a long time. I get that point, but the problem is that neither should be forced under this sort of regime of standardization. So to end up then, the whole gist of this is to say, if in fact I've got this narrative right and that the meta-narrative I'm restricting this to the US in this particular paper. It certainly could be made global, as I've indicated before, with regard to the IMF and the World Bank. But for the United States and the implications of United Statesian meta-narratives, right, the discourse that we use to talk about schools, the more that it becomes assumed to be an accurate description of the world, and the terms that we use in describing that world, accurately or not, are from the business world, and we unknowingly promote that language, I think we're doing a detriment to what we otherwise should be doing, which is criticizing the hell out of it and saying, as soon as you start talking about accountability, pull back and ask why you're not talking about responsibility instead. Just as one indication.